Welcome to the final panel of the Hamilton Lugar School's sixth conference on America's role in the world, Trust and Authenticity in Social Media. It is our pleasure to welcome our moderator, Elaine Monaghan. Elaine joined IU Bloomington's Media School as a professor of practice in 2014 and teaches classes on reporting, writing, and media ethics. A veteran foreign correspondent, she serves as coordinator for the school's news reporting and editing concentration, and as co-lead for education at IU's Observatory on Social Media. Her recent work has focused on developing a master's in data journalism that will launch in fall 2021 and be taught collaboratively with the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. Elaine convenes the social media track of IU's new Ethics, Values, and Technology project, which joins the Hamilton Lugar School as a co-sponsor of this panel. Elaine started out in journalism in 1993 when she joined Reuters' training program in London. She ran Reuters' Dublin bureau at the height of Northern Ireland's peace process, served as the State Department's correspondent during the 9/11 attacks, and covered Russia during the First Chechen War and the Yeltsin re-election.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Janae. It's absolutely wonderful to be here with all of you to discuss this incredibly important topic of trust and authenticity in social media. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with friends, old and new, to have this conversation and looking forward to hearing questions from the audience. So send them in. We're really keen to include you in our discussion. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then each of us will make a few remarks, and Professor Menzer-Phil will have a short presentation to share with you, and after that we'll open it up for discussion. So without further ado, welcome again to this final panel of the America's Role in the World conference. We're delighted to be part of that. And thanks to our co-sponsors, IU's Ethics, Values and Technology project. So first I'd like to introduce Paul Barrett, who's the Deputy Director of the Center for Business and Human Rights at New York University's Stern School of Business. He came to the Stern School in 2017, having served for more than 3 decades as a journalist and author, focusing on the intersection of business, law, and society. He was at Bloomberg Businessweek magazine for 12 years, and at various times there, edited an award-winning investigative team and wrote about energy and the environment, military procurement, and the civilian firearm industry. From 1986 to 2005, Paul wrote for the Wall Street Journal, where his assignments included covering the Supreme Court. He has written 4 critically acclaimed non-fiction books, including 2 which were optioned for Hollywood movies, and they were Glock, The Rise of America's Gun, and The Law of the Jungle, the $19 billion legal battle over oil in the rainforest, and the lawyer who'd stop at nothing to win. Welcome, Paul. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
I should mention that Paul, in the context of this panel, is particularly focused on the obligations of the social media industry in a democracy, including disinformation, the consequences of outsourced content moderation, and the debate over the liability of social media platforms for content posted by their users, which is an issue I think is close to all of our hearts. Paul has a JD from Harvard Law School and teaches a seminar called Law, Economics and Journalism. I'd next like to introduce Emily Bell, with whom I have a long friendship on Facebook, and it's delightful to be here with you today, Emily, finally. Emily is founding director of the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. She's a leading thinker, commentator, and strategist on digital journalism, who spent much of her journalism career at The Guardian, specifically Guardian News and Media, where she was an award-winning writer and editor. As editor-in-chief across Guardian websites and director of digital content for Guardian News and Media, Emily led a web team that led the field in live blogging, multimedia formats, data, and social media, making The Guardian a recognized pioneer in the field. She is co-author of Post-Industrial Journalism, Adapting to the Present, with C.W. Anderson and Clay Shirky. Emily has many responsibilities, including serving as a trustee on the board of the Scott Trust, the owners of The Guardian, a member of the Columbia Journalism Review's Board of Overseers, an advisor to Tamedia Group in Switzerland, chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Advisory Council on Social Media, Emily is also a member of Pointer's National Advisory Board. Welcome, Emily. Thank you for finding the time to be here. I'd like next to introduce my colleague, Phil Menser, who's from right here at IU Bloomington. Phil is a distinguished professor of informatics and computer science, and he directs the Observatory on Social Media, and he'll be sharing some of that work with you today. His many accolades include a laureate in physics from the Sapienza University of Rome and a PhD in computer science and cognitive science from the University of California, San Diego. Phil is an ACM Distinguished Scientist, a Fellow of the Center for Computer Mediated Communications, Senior Research Fellow of the Kinsey Institute, and a board member of the IU Network Science Institute. His research interests span web and data science, computational social science, science of science, and modeling of complex information networks. This past decade, Phil's lab has led efforts to study online misinformation spread and to develop tools to detect and counter social media manipulation. This work has been covered in many international news sources, and I'm not going to name them all because there's so many of them, but let's just say in all the good places. Well done, Phil. Phil is the associate editor of the Network Science Journal and on the editorial boards of EPJ Data Science, PeerJ Computer Science, and the Harvard Misinformation Review. Welcome, Phil. And finally, welcome to Dr. Julie Passetti, who's a multi-award winning, internationally published journalist and academic who serves on the external advisory board of the Observatory, where Phil and I also work, so that's great. Julie is the inaugural Global Director of Research with the International Centre for Journalists, where she leads the Journalism and the Pandemic Project in collaboration with Emily's Centre. And a major global study, and I think this is really crucial, into online violence against women journalists. Thank you for that work, Julie. Julie also co-leads the hashtag Hold the Line Coalition, an advocacy partnership that campaigns on behalf of prominent American Filipino journalist Maria Ressa, whose case is emblematic of convergent threats confronting journalism and democracy globally. Julie brings 3 decades of high-level international journalism practice to her research, including time as a news editor, documentary reporter, and national political correspondent with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Welcome, Julie. So I am thoroughly exhausted having listed all of this incredible panel's amazing accomplishments.
We do sound very impressive, Elaine. You put it like that.
You really do. So we are now very anxious to hear your thoughts. So I'd just like to remind the audience that you can share your questions through the conference website, and they will be delivered directly to my inbox, and I will then pass them on to the panelists. But I am claiming moderator privileges, and I have 2 framing questions I'd like to ask. We're going to hear first from Paul, then Emily, then Julie, and then Phil's going to give you a short presentation. So the questions that I'd like to pose to our panel are, first of all, what does it take to be a good digital citizen? And second of all, what do you think the key issues are for the incoming Biden administration in the context of this social media world that we're discussing? So Paul, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those 2 questions first.
Sure. Well, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction. On the question of being a good digital citizen, at the risk of sounding a little simplistic, I would suggest that we would benefit from all of us slowing down a little bit online, hesitating before retweeting, and specifically thinking twice before getting into politically tinged flame wars with people we may know or not know. It makes no difference. I think so much of the misinformation and unpleasantness and harmful content comes as a result of unthought out commenting and verbal fisticuffs. And if people showed more restraint, I think that would be salutary. I'm not sure that there's a way to enforce that. I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't want the government to enforce that. But as individuals, I think we could all practice better digital hygiene. In terms of the Biden administration, I think they will be met with, whether they like it or not, the question of what is to be done about content moderation by the large social media sites, and that will take them to the fight over the future of Section 230, the law that currently protects from liability social media platforms in terms of user posted material, and also protects their ability to moderate content as they see fit. And the administration is going to have to come up with some type of formula, I expect, other than just leave everything the way it is, because there are such persistent demands from multiple directions for change in this area. And I think one potential avenue of change would be to think about amending Section 230 so that the liability shield remains in place, but that the law becomes a vehicle for imposing new obligations on the social media platforms in terms of transparency and accountability. So, for example, that they would have to reveal more about how their algorithms actually operate and who sees what and why as a condition of continuing to enjoy the protection that Section 230 affords. I'll mention a couple of other areas without going into any detail. I think the question of privacy protection will return to the fore, something that was debated but never really got traction during the Obama administration. And I think that's now something that is important. And the question of are the social media platforms too big is already on the plate in the form of a pending antitrust lawsuit against Google and possibly a separate lawsuit against Facebook. And so the administration is going to have to sort out what they want to do in connection with antitrust. So I think that will be a very full platter of issues for them to deal with right off the bat.
Super. Thank you so much, Paul, for getting the ball rolling. Emily, I'm most curious to hear what you think about those things, or anything else you'd like to add to our plate.
Sure. I mean, I think, Paul was completely right on the first question of what does it take to be a good digital citizen, being more discerning, thinking before you share, looking at the provenance and integrity of material. But I would flip the question a little bit and say, I think there's much too much of a requirement on individuals to police this system. And that's not how it should work. We shouldn't be requiring individual responsibility for something which is so critical to the dissemination of, both democratic, but also, as we've seen in the pandemic, life-saving information. And I think it's become a talking point of the platforms to really boost two ideas which I think are valuable. One of increased media literacy and behavior among audiences to be more informed about what they're seeing and do the sorting for themselves. And then this very sort of slippery and I think formless, difficult question of increasing trust in journalism. So I've been to so many technology dominated conferences where Google and Facebook have said, we need to improve trust in journalism, we need to improve media literacy, we need to be better digital citizens. It's a distraction from the issue which, again, Paul put his finger on, which is, we actually need a pretty comprehensive reform of the entire communications commons. And I think that that's a difficult thing for particularly any incoming American administration, because of the relationship between the Constitution and what we think of as, the free press, and how that's now enmeshed in a whole set of different systems that we just didn't anticipate. Before, even sort of 25 years ago, kind of what we're encountering now is unthinkable. So that brings me on to the second part of what should be on the agenda for an incoming Biden presidency. And Paul, who's really kind of much better versed in all this than I am, I think is absolutely right about some of the reforms we need to look at. I would completely echo the idea that instead of scrapping Section 230, we do need to think about access and accountability, adding that layer of transparency so that we can just have more accountable, the platforms can be more accountable. Antitrust is again a uniquely American way of tackling a problem that perhaps other authorities would use different regulatory environments for. I think at some point, though, this is going to be so difficult. We do, that particularly a pro-democracy government, and it feels very odd to say that about America because you would think they're all pro-democracy, but we've just seen that that's not the case. A pro-democracy government is going to have to start to think about how to support good speech and integrity, information with integrity, in a more active way. And again, the constitutional barriers to doing that may be too high, and the political will may be lacking. By that I mean, you don't have a public media system in America. You have public media, and you have lots of media, but you don't have a public media system. And you need to create, I think, some kind of certainty that local communities will be able to access relevant information and news, which is helpful, useful, and accurate and accountable. I think you have to think about how you support existing good faith journalistic operations whilst they undergo this really hellish transition into a world of no advertising, reader support. And, our research at the Tower Centre has focused a lot on what's moving into that vacuum at local level, which are hyper-partisan, often fake news sites. I know we're not meant to use the phrase fake news, but these are genuinely news sites that appear to be giving you local news, but which are actually, part of a fairly pernicious influence machine which works over a long period of time. So I think that, we need two things. We need to, I think, look beyond fighting misinformation. Everybody on this call is doing this. We've been doing this for this past year. But we also have to think about what are the structures, the laws and the institutions we're going to build to support better access, better creation of kinds of news and information that we need. And then, the platforms need to prioritize it as well. I'll just sort of finish by saying, I think that economists are well versed in something called Gresham's law, which is basically the principle that when you have an unregulated market, bad money, in other words, unscrupulous dealers, will always drive out good money. And you have to think about the speech economy in the same way. And we have an unregulated speech market at the moment, and bad speech in that environment will always drive out good speech, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, grifting, whatever you want to call it. So we have to think about, what is our Glass-Steagall in this environment. So it should be interesting. I really hope that the Biden administration takes a hold of this, but I have to say I'm operating more in hope than expectation.
Thank you, Emily, for that incredibly thought-provoking contribution. And as much as I want to dive in and ask more questions and share some of the excellent audience questions that are coming in, I'm going to move on to Julie and Phil. But before I do that, just a reminder that if you are out there on social media sharing responsible responses to our discussion, please use the hashtag ARW, America's Role in the World, ARW6. Julie, what have you got to say about all of this?
Yes, what does an Australian living in Oxford, working for a United States-based philanthropic organisation, the International Centre for Journalists, have to say? Well, a fair bit, based partly on the fact that, yes, I am a journalist and I'm somebody who has been researching disinformation responses over the past 4 or 5 years from an editorial perspective, but also from a media literacy perspective. I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I would just particularly underline Emily's point about the fact that we've seen the responsibility shifting, a sort of attempt to avoid responsibility, I would argue, by internet communications companies through this emphasis, and an emphasis that has funding attached to it, on individual responsibility. I mean, I certainly think it's important that as individuals, as we are expected to do within broader society, we behave in a respectful manner. We behave in a way that does, help explain rather than inflame differences, and we behave in ways that do not result in people being attacked online with increasing risks offline, which is what we're seeing at the moment. And you mentioned, Elaine, that I'm leading a project for UNESCO, which is studying the international implications of online violence against women journalists. And we've just released some data and about to release more next week. But the 2 points that I'll share right now that give us an indication of how serious the toxicity is online, particularly targeting women journalists at the intersection of disinformation and misogyny. We see online violence, as I call this combination of threats that women journalists are experiencing, escalating. 73% of our respondents, we surveyed nearly 1,200 people. The women among that group said that they had experienced online violence. 73% of them said that. And 20% said that they had experienced attacks offline, so abuse and attacks offline that they believed had been seeded online. And they gave examples to us of, patterns of language being used, of references to particular memes that have been seeded and spread online. So this I think is a particularly pernicious problem, or it began as a pernicious problem. It's actually a problem that is increasing exponentially. And you can see the levels of toxicity associated with politics in the US and internationally. But the fact that you've just had somebody being characterized as a strongman president for 4 years, with parallels being drawn with Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duterte in the Philippines, for example, I think there are incredible challenges for the incoming Biden administration, but also for individual citizens, to actually step back, to think carefully about their reactions to comments, to pause, as Paul said. I would say pause, then check what it is that you're feeling, and check whatever the information is that you want to share before you engage. And I used to talk about with students when I was a journalism educator, like Emily and yourself. I would say apply the rule that we used to use in broadcasting, which involved a 7-second delay. There's often a 7-second delay when you're live to air, to give yourself that opportunity to recover from any problems, but any kind of swearing or untoward behavior by an interviewee, for example, or somebody calling in. So that sort of principle is useful at an individual level. But how do you inculcate that, more broadly within society? I think fundamentally we have to think of the internet communications companies, the social platforms, as digital citizens. And as digital citizens, they have behaved appallingly. And so I think if there's a contract for civility and a contract for accountability and transparency, then we have to ensure that that's at the foot of the platforms, these very rich, very powerful companies. And to flip now to thinking specifically about the incoming Biden administration's opportunities to respond to this, the first thing that concerns me is no matter what good intentions might be in existence and being shared up front, there is incredible power and incredible money attached to this debate. And that is a very difficult double-headed threat. The political power that comes with that level of financial power, how to counter the deleterious impacts of the platform's behavior on our communities, on our societies. How can that happen from a regulatory standpoint, but not just how can that happen through regulation, through law reform, through a whole range of other measures? What are the implications internationally? How can we actually develop an internationally focused response led within the US, because these companies are based in the US and the decisions that they make have global implications. I mean, we have a genocide that occurred in Myanmar that was attributed in no small part to Facebook's role. And there's ongoing, legal cases before the International Court of Human Rights in reference to that. We also have the situation in the Philippines where Maria Ressa herself talks about the collapse of democracy being intertwined with Facebook's enabling of viral and networked disinformation. And associated with all that is the suppression of independent critical journalism, which the US has a fundamentally important role through its constitutional protections to reassert. But I would argue that there is going to be a period of time where the US soul searching needs to be led effectively by the Biden administration in terms of the press freedom defense role, that has typically or traditionally been played, because many of us watching will not just accept a reassertion of that role without evidence. So there needs to be, evidence-based responses from the Biden administration early on around protection of journalists, around defense of media freedom. And I think in reference to that as well, I would argue that their initially slated plan to focus on online violence against women, which is an important initiative and one they announced very early on after the result was declared, should also include a focus on targeted online violence against women journalists and human rights defenders, because of this evidence that we are seeing of targeted attacks and really deleterious effects on women's engagement with journalism, women's involvement in journalism. And diversity and respect for diversity are critical areas, I think, tied up with these responses. And I'll leave it there, Elaine. I don't know how long I've been talking, but...
a very appropriate amount of time, Julie. These are such big issues, it's very hard. Every word so far has just been tremendously valuable, and I'm really, happy about the great topics and themes that have surfaced already in the short time we've been together. And I just want to remind our audience to send in questions. And now I would like to hand the floor over to my wonderful colleague, Phil Menzer, who's going to share some information with you about his work at the Observatory in social media and probably elsewhere. Let's find out.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you all. This is amazing panels. All the points that you're making strongly resonate with the research that Elaine and I are doing here. And I would like to take a few minutes to show you some of the work that we do and how it connects to the issue of, especially the issue of authenticity online. And it really connects to the questions, Elaine, that you're asking. What can citizens do? And part of the answer to that also has to do with being aware about what environment we're in, what our information ecosystem looks like, and the fact that it is also an adversarial place where it's not just a marketplace of ideas where we're just discussing with other people, but there are actors that are trying to, to manipulate this space. And so, of course, that also goes towards your second question about the incoming administration. And as others have already pointed out, there are huge challenges in terms of regulation, the role of platforms, and some of the vulnerabilities that these platforms have stem from attempts to manipulate them. So, if it's okay, I would like to share my screen to show a few slides. Okay. Hopefully you can see them. And so the idea of authenticity, I should really say inauthenticity, because, as the old saying goes, nobody knows on the internet that, that you're a dog, and it applies to social media where often you don't know exactly who you're talking with. So I'm gonna briefly address three different ways in which this inauthenticity makes us vulnerable: echo chambers, information overload, and engagement bias. So in terms of echo chambers, let me start from an example. This is a typical disinformation campaign. We see many of these days. This particular one I selected because we were the target. Our research group was the target. This was several years ago during a midterm election. And there were false narratives about our research on misinformation being really a secret administration, project to suppress political speech or to kill the First Amendment or to spy on American citizens and so on. So a lot of these narratives were going viral, and we tracked how they were spreading from person to person. So this picture here is what we call a diffusion network. A node in this network represents a Twitter user, and a link between two nodes represents how one of these disinformation narratives were spreading from person to person through retweets, resharing, mentions, and so on. And so how did this particular disinformation campaign fit within the conversation that was happening around the election? And so if you map that onto the disinformation, sorry, the sort of the information ecosystem at that time, this was 2014, it looked like this. This is something that we and others have shown. Our information networks are highly polarized. Conservatives tend to retweet other conservatives. Liberals tend to retweet other liberals. There is not a lot of cross communication. And the nodes in the network that I showed you earlier are shown as purple nodes here. And you can see that most of them are on one side. And then it's hard to see, there are a couple of orange nodes on the left. Those were accounts that were actually sharing debunking information, from Science Magazine that was, fact-checking these claims and saying that they were false. So, but the point of this picture is that given this particular echo chamber structure of our information ecosystem, you are somewhere probably within an echo chamber, and you are most vulnerable to narratives that target that particular group and counter information that would help you figure out what's true and what's false. Even if it's available, it exists, it's not necessarily available to you. You're not exposed to information that would help you understand what's going on. And this can happen, of course, on either side. This particular example was on the right. So one of the tools that we develop here at the observatory is called Hoaxy. It allows us to visualize these diffusion networks. So you can select an article, for example, from a low credibility sources or a hashtag, whatever, and then see who is sharing it, what are the communities that are having these conversations, what is the competition between low credibility information and fact-checking information, who are the influential, we call them super spreaders, and also what is the role of automated accounts like social bots in spreading or amplifying certain narratives. So this tool also collects a lot of information. So if we zoom out and we look at a very large collection of links shared online during the 2016 election, many from low credibility sources and some from fact-checking sources, you see another example of this kind of echo chamber. Here in purple, these are people sharing, these are sharing of links to low credibility sources, fake news, conspiracy theories, and hyper-partisan content, and so on. And in orange, you can see sharing of fact-checking. And you can see that the people who are most vulnerable to the misinformation are mostly talking to other people who are also likely to share that and less likely to be exposed to fact-checking. Furthermore, as you dive towards the core of this misinformation network here, this plot shows you that you see more and more evidence of potentially automated accounts. So these are accounts created by actors who are trying to influence the debate, and they can do so by, by controlling multiple accounts and trying to amplify these narratives. Today, unfortunately, we see very high volume and successful efforts to manufacture these kinds of echo chambers on a very large scale, where there is a number of highly active accounts. We call them controllers. They use so-called follow trains to tell others who they should follow, who they should retweet. And it is very easy to write scripts to create fake accounts that automatically will amplify any narrative that is created in these kind of echo chambers. These become artificial megaphones to amplify whatever narrative is created by these conductors. To explore this further, we created some benign social bots, accounts that start from a particular place, let's say by following a news source, one that is on the left or one that is on the right or one that is on the center. And then after that, these accounts are completely identical to each other, completely automated and completely neutral. They simply retweet and follow random people and random messages. And what you see that just depending on that very first account that they follow on Twitter, they find themselves inevitably in these echo chambers. If you start following, Breitbart, you find yourself in a conservative echo chamber. If you start following I don't know, HuffPost, you find yourself in a liberal echo chamber. And so it's kind of inevitable, even if we don't have a strong bias towards one of these sides, we inevitably find ourselves in these echo chambers when we're online. So secondly, information overload is also an important factor. So here is a diffusion network for an example of viral disinformation. This was the claim during 2016 that the Clinton campaign was involved in satanic rituals. It was a precursor of the Pizzagate and now the QAnon conspiracy theories. This particular example, it was one of the most viral pieces of misinformation. And so one of the questions is, why does some misinformation spread so virally? In fact, low credibility information is as likely or more likely to spread virally as reliable information. That's what this plot shows. So we built some models here at the observatory to explore these questions, and I won't go into the detail, but this picture shows that as you assume that in a realistic way, agents have more information available to them, but they have limited attention so that they can only pay attention to a small fraction of what is posted by their friends. And this is, of course, driven by what they see on their social feed. So the more there is this information overload or limited attention, the more likely it is that low credibility information, which is shown here as these smaller nodes, will go viral. Even though in these models, the agents can recognize high quality information and preferentially share high quality information out of whatever they are exposed to in their feed. But when there is so much junk and they can only see a portion of it, inevitably a lot of low credibility junk will spread virally. And so one technique that is adopted widely to engender this kind of dynamics is flooding the zone with, well, there is this quote, you can read it yourself from Steve Bannon, but flooding the zone with junk, with misinformation. And in fact, we observe accounts online that can share the same link to the same false news thousands, even tens of thousands of times. So we actually do observe online this technique of flooding. And so we also develop models to see how dangerous, how harmful can this flooding technique can be. So we imagine that we have a bunch of inauthentic accounts. They could be automated, but they don't need to be, but they're coordinated to spread, let's say, some low quality information. What is the effect on the overall ecosystem? Well, if they're kind of peripheral, they don't do a lot of damage. So these other nodes here, these gray nodes, a lot of them have light, colors, light gray. That means that they're sharing mostly high quality information. But if you assume that these coordinated inauthentic accounts can infiltrate a sufficient portion of the network, and this is not a large portion, let's say get 1% of humans to follow them, then we see that they can actually suppress quality in the system. So this is what Emily was referring a few minutes ago. The bad speech will take over good speech. And so this idea of the marketplace of ideas where the best ideas will win, that's not the world in which we live. We live in a world where a few actors that are coordinated, that can exploit weaknesses of platforms, can take over and suppress the quality of information in the ecosystem. We developed tools like Botometer, a machine learning algorithm to try and detect the presence of these inauthentic or automated accounts. But it is becoming harder and harder because there is a lot of interest, money, and political power in evading detection from systems like this. And furthermore, a lot of inauthentic accounts are not automated. So we are developing techniques to develop coordinated inauthentic campaigns, whether or not the participants are automated. And we've seen examples of these coordinated inauthentic campaigns spreading misinformation about the pandemic, spreading misinformation about the white helmets in Syria, trying to affect discussions about the Hong Kong protests, also performing manipulation of cryptocurrencies through pump and dump fraud schemes, and also in US politics through either accounts that are hacked or people who allow certain political organizations to control their accounts and post on their behalf, or even apps that let people allow organizations to post on their behalf, or even in some cases, people who just get paid. So recently, there was a report, we did an analysis of a bunch of tweets from fake accounts created by teenagers in Arizona who were paid to post misinformation about the election and about the pandemic. So these are all ways in which we observe these coordinated campaigns. And lastly, engagement bias. And what I mean here is that platforms, of course, use popularity and engagement as a proxy for quality. But our models show that very likely these kinds of algorithms amplify noise, so that the more what you see on your social media news feed is driven by popularity, the more the overall quality of the system goes down. And this is without assuming any abuse, just because of the mechanics of the system that I won't go into the detail. Of course, the idea of doing this is the wisdom of the crowd, the idea that this will let the platform sort out what's interesting by seeing what people are paying attention to. But actually, there is a very narrow regime in which this kind of mechanism works. In general, the more attention you give to stuff that appears to be popular, the more you're actually mostly amplifying noise. This is from the point of view of the platforms, but the point of view of the users, we are also affected by these engagement metrics. So we have an app called Fakey, which is sort of let's say, a news literacy game, where you see a stream of current news, some from low quality sources, some from mainstream sources, and you have to decide what to share and what to fact check. And we ran an experiment by showing people engagement, like how many people have liked or shared something. We found that the more people think that a piece of news has high engagement, is very popular, the more they're likely to share it, even if it's a low credibility article. And the less likely they are to fact check low credibility articles, again, if they believe that they are high engagement. So just by merely being exposed to these engagement signals, we become also more vulnerable, which goes back to your question, Elaine, about what we can do. We have to realize that we are vulnerable. And as Paul said, think a while, wait the seconds. I would say don't share something you haven't read and things of that nature. So inauthentic accounts can exploit these vulnerabilities. They can create the appearance that many people are sharing something to induce us to pay attention to them. So when we look at retweets of low credibility information, we find that most of those retweets come from humans, likely humans. But if we look at what those humans are retweeting or who they are retweeting, we find that they are retweeting humans, but they're also retweeting bots. So this is one way in which authenticity can exploit our engagement bias and get us to, to fall for the trap and retweet inauthentic stuff. So the last tool I'll mention is called Bot Slayer. Is software that anybody can use to set up their own pipeline in the cloud to monitor narratives that are spreading virally and detect in real time whether these are supported by inauthentic accounts or by coordinated accounts. So in this example here, this is a visualization from Hoaxy. This is one instance where there was one particular narrative, which was a fake news video from a Russian source that was amplified by a bunch of Russian bots. These are these red circles. They had just been created, and the whole purpose was to make it appear like everybody was sharing this video or watching this video on YouTube and get it to become viral. So these are all ways in which we're vulnerable, and at the very least we need to be aware of and understand these mechanisms to figure out how to protect ourselves at the individual level, but also how regulation should let's say help platforms set up mechanisms to decrease these vulnerabilities. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Phil. It's a lot to process, but I would just want to remind our audience that you can go and engage with these tools by going to the websites that Phil just shared. And if I can figure out how to use them, anyone can. Still working on it. But they are intended for anyone to work with, so don't hesitate. So we've actually had some good questions from the audience, and I wanted to just start with one that picks up, I think, on a theme that all of you have addressed in different ways. This idea that, you know, if we're trying to measure how good our digital citizenship is, we have to think of our social media platforms as digital citizens, which is a very good way of framing that problem that I heartily agree with. And one question that's come in light of the violence against women journalists, the Rohingya population, and other historically marginalized groups, is there a way to flag messages, posts, and so on that may contain violent content or incite violence? And if so, if there is a pattern of violent posts from a particular person or group, would it be a viable option to remove them from access to social media platforms? Could non-violence be included as part of the terms of agreement of even having a social media account? So I open that up to the floor. Would anyone like to jump in on that?
I wouldn't mind responding. Sorry, Emily, was that a pencil?
Pencil, yeah.
Going up. Do you want to go first?
Put my hands up. Well, so just very briefly, I mean, the answer to that is yes, yes, and yes. You know, actually all of these are viable options. I think it's very interesting when you look at the UN report into the Rohingya, and actually I'd urge people to read Amnesty International's report this week on what's been happening in Vietnam, where you have a very similar set of problems dealt with in a slightly different way. So if you look at what happened in Myanmar, you had a complete lack of any stewardship on the ground whatsoever by Facebook, and you didn't have language skills at the company that could actually spot these things before they happened. You didn't have even something as basic as, and I hesitate to use this word, as a newsroom, which knows and can detect the cultural atmosphere and can put in place guardrails before these things happen. I think these are things that we've learned that are possible on social platforms. Social platforms tend to respond by saying these approaches don't scale. And I would say in like 90% of cases, they don't necessarily need to scale. You know, we're talking about, you know, this very harmful, violent content, thankfully, is still a minority of what we see, but it's the risks attached to it are outsized. So I think, you know, the platforms need to move to a point where, which they have done actually to some extent through the 2020 election, I think is a watershed in terms of how much they're prepared to get involved in certain situations, where they will flag, remove, block. But then if you read the Amnesty report this week, the big problem is this sounds great when it's in the hands of people that we would consider to be, you know, well motivated. When you put it in the hands of, say, the Vietnamese government, which wants to suppress journalists and activists, you can see actually how quickly Facebook moved to remove pages, accounts, posts, without even warning the journalists that was happening. So even by Facebook's own transparency report, you see that removals went up by something like 800% from just under 100 to over 900 in the course of a year because of the speech laws in Vietnam. So we see that when there's enforcement behind it, Facebook can move very quickly, and they can move quickly to remove certain types of speech. Violence absolutely falls into a category that they can tackle in this way and that they should tackle in this way. So I think it's really interesting that you have this very articulate question saying, is this even a possibility? That we live in a world where people don't think or think that this might be difficult to do, I think is where platforms have for too long really championed or they've won in a way a perception battle that some of these problems are too difficult to encounter, and they are absolutely not. They're absolutely not too difficult, but they will take investment and they'll take time.
Julie, I think you wanted in, and I'm sure Paul has something to say as well.
And indeed, I mean, I just published a book with some colleagues from the University of Sheffield and researchers from around the world who work in civil society as well, commissioned by the UN. It's called Balancing Act, and it goes to that very question that Emily alluded to there. So we have to be able to balance the desire for regulation, the very valid desire for regulation or even algorithmic power to counter hate speech that is capable of triggering significant violence. It's not just the violent content that's the problem, it's the hate speech that can trigger violent reactions offline. But we have to balance those desires and expectations, which are often framed within the context of liberal democracies, and particularly where the US-based companies are, against the risks of over-regulation, of overreaction, of over-responses to disinformation in particular, which is what we're seeing in the context of responses to misinformation and disinformation during the pandemic, for example. So in that book, we made something like 90 recommendations for dealing with these challenges of trying to balance these issues. And there's also a 23-point plan in that book, which is designed for organizations and governments to be able to try and address some of these critical concerns while also being mindful of international human rights law protections for freedom of expression. And I would just add to that I agree with what Emily just said, that there's this deflection and sort of it's instinctive deflection of responsibility that I've experienced while researching these issues by the platforms. How amazing have they been in reference to pulling disinformation and misinformation connected to false information about COVID-19. We saw two big flashpoints, I think, that demonstrated how quickly they could act when they put their resources to the task. And they did so without causing, huge backlash or huge problems with regard to many of those removals. This is a different situation that Emily describes in Vietnam, and there have been similar situations in the Middle East where there is less scrutiny, perhaps, of these reactions by such companies with regard to their responsibility to media freedom. And just to come back to that point, there is an international human rights law framework that should be at the center of the design of these platforms. That has not been. And now is the work of trying to somehow retrofit responsibilities and commitments to such frameworks. And that's at the center of the work that the Information and Democracy Forum recently published, which is again something that I'd encourage your team and those listening to dig into. They came up with a set of principles and recommended actions to try and address some of these concerns. So there's a lot of really great, quite radical thinking going on. It's whether or not there is the will and the responsibility, I think, on behalf of those companies.
Yeah, political will, that magic sauce. Paul, did you want to add something?
No, just very quickly to underscore what's already been said. Hate speech, speech promoting violence. These are areas where the battle in terms of policy has already been won. The policies are in place. It's a question of holding the platforms to enforcing the policies that they have. The second point being that we've just been through a really extraordinary year with both the pandemic and the American election. And we've seen, as Julie was saying, how quickly basically unilaterally the platforms can act when they choose to. And the question is whether they're going to carry over that type of vigor and that type of vigilance to sort of ordinary life. And there really is no reason that they should not do that. But in fact, they do not intend to do that. They have been underscoring, not very loudly, but in interviews and other venues, that they consider a lot of this to have been exceptional, and they're going to go back to so-called normal. And so I think this is a reason for worry. And those of us who follow these things should be urging the platforms to say, no, take a lesson from what you've just done more or less successfully and do more of it.
Thank you, Paul. Do more of it. Phil, I think you wanted to chime in with something.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very briefly, first I wanted to answer the question very explicitly about terms of service. So yes, if we're looking at violence, for example, as Paul was mentioning, this is already in the terms of service. So if you actually read the terms of service of most platforms, they will already say that you're not allowed to, post incitement to violence. However, what I would like to say is that despite, I agree with what other panelists have said, but I also want to say that it is not that trivial, or at least that there are challenges. We have to be realistic about the challenges. So first of all, when the platforms say that it's hard to do at scale, what they mean is that they can't design artificial intelligence algorithms to automatically detect, misinformation and disinformation and violence. And this is true. These are problems that are really hard to do, and they are outside of our technical reach. So of course, that means that we need to have humans do it. We need human moderation. And to some degree, and to different degrees for different platforms, some reluctantly, to some extent, we have some movement in that. And so I agree with what everybody else is saying, that platforms need to do more, but we also have to be realistic that it is an enormous effort, because they have to hire armies of people who are able to make these judgments all around the world, in all different languages, in different countries with different laws. And yes, they should do it, of course, but it is not trivial. It is a huge undertaking, and so we have to be to be aware of that. And then of course there's all sorts of can of worms, because for example, different countries have different laws. They're not all democratic. So, if the platform has to follow the laws of a particular country, they may end up doing things that we would consider immoral. So it's not really a trivial problem. Today, for example, WeChat applied their terms to suppress a statement from an Australian politician, and they labeled it as I don't know, misinformation or something. So politics gets mixed with our definition of what's true, what's false, what's violence. Or here in the US, we have politicians who say this particular person should be shot. Is it violence? Well, if they are asked later, they would say, "Oh, I wasn't serious, I was joking." So there are challenges. And then the final point I wanted to make, even if we just focus here on the United States, the more platforms are willing, as we're happy to witness, to to moderate harmful disinformation, the more some people are leaving those platforms. And so that may lead to an even more fragmented social media space where there are large sections potentially of the population that will be segregated into these groups, where we'll have even stronger echo chambers where their opinions are unchallenged and so on. So I agree with everybody, with all the points made so far, but I just wanted to say that it is not a trivial problem. And even when we're talking about Section 230, as Paul was saying, right now we have half of our politicians who say that it should be changed in the way that Paul was suggesting. And then the other half of the politicians that said that it should be changed so that platforms should not be even allowed to do the kind of moderation that we're talking about here. So let's not forget that there is no general agreement on these issues, even at the political level.
I have a feeling that another round of discussion is going to happen right now on this subject, but I just want to throw in another little breadcrumb of thought with another question from the audience that I think is somewhat related to what Phil was just saying. Understanding that truth can be somewhat fluid in definition, could social media algorithms that feed users information aligned with their preferences do more to filter for truth and verified facts? So just to complicate the conversation even more, I'll throw that in. And Emily, I'm going to throw the ball back to you, because I have a feeling you might want to add something.
Well, I think it's like, and I'm sure that Phil, who studies this from a sort of computational aspect, will, he knows this much better than I do, and also the kind of the technical difficulties to doing that. But from a cultural perspective, I do think that, if you use a framework which Camille Francois, who's a great, works for Graphica, is a great disinformation researcher, she came up with this framework, which was ABC of actor behavior content, which is something I teach students, which is very useful. And it's interesting to me how, when you talk to platform companies about how they are thinking, what they include in different lists which they weight at, that they give different algorithmic weight to. That often the focus is on the C, is on the content, where it really needs to be on the A and the B, which is who are these people and what is their track record, and that's very difficult political territory. So, for instance, Facebook has started to label and work on what they call a high quality news tab. I think there's not an academic in probably America and maybe even the world who hasn't been asked, should we include Breitbart, well-known right-wing website, in our high quality news tab, which I think is included there. And my response was absolutely not, because they are not a reliable source of information. In other words, you might look at any number of individual pieces of content and see that they are fine. They're just aggregations or reporting of straightforward news. But like, Russia Today, Sputnik News, all sorts of other kind of actors that have this kind of framework of how they work, every so often they will use their reach and their spread to put something into the information stream which is absolutely not right, deliberately. It's a kind of an act of manipulation. And they don't apologize for it, they don't clarify it, and they don't correct it if they are called out on it. So we know that there are types of behaviors that good faith news organizations, good faith information providers actually, that are committed to. And it's not incredibly difficult to actually architect that within a system. And it simply just hasn't been the case at the moment. We did some research this year on these sort of fake news websites which have hyperpartisan backing in them. And we found that despite lots of statements from Facebook and Google about wanting to create an environment of high quality reporting, wanted to prioritize high quality reporting, we found that, for instance, a lot of these sites were actually labeled as news sources within Google News. We found that all of them can self-identify as news media organizations within Facebook's database. And it's actually quite hard for researchers to interrogate that. There's no way of interrogating that directory within Facebook. So I do think that, just starting to think that there is a difference and how those categories can be applied computationally, certainly by engaging in all sorts of things we know from, empirical communications research about, what is a good actor, what is a bad actor, but the companies are going to have to grapple with the problem that much more of this just quantitatively comes from the right than it comes from the left. So in actually sort of constructing that model, they're going to find themselves back in this kind of cycle of, politicized rhetoric that Phil was just actually was just referring to then. So I think definitely there are things that can be done. The reluctance of the platforms to do them so far, I think, has been a little bit dismaying. But, again, as Phil said, we've actually seen or Julie was saying, sorry, we've seen the grass the nettle around COVID. I think the next big hill to climb on this, if you like, is a much tighter sort of categorization of sources and an attendant sort of reweighting of algorithms towards that, or a real change in how we see kind of news feeds mix between sort of non-news information, etc.
Julie,
Sure.
how do we fix this problem?
Well, I think one of the things we have to focus on is the sources of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, and recognize certainly, the platforms have responsibilities in this regard. If we can take the example, the very recent example, an ongoing example of Donald Trump and Facebook, where Facebook had a policy, especially, and they've said this on record, especially with reference to the US, because of proximity to power. That's their physical proximity to US power, makes them much more reluctant to deal with misinformation and hate speech that is, prolific out of the mouth of a political leader, particularly a president, for example. So that started to shift, and as a result, as Emily and others have said, with the US election and the sorts of responses and shifts we've seen there, some of them minor, some of them quite significant, depending on the platform. But not only do we have to have an acceptance that political leaders, politicians should be subject to the same level of scrutiny and accountability, but in parallel, there needs to be, beyond the platforms addressing this, political leadership. And this gets back to the question of what the incoming Biden administration can do. Take the example of after the 2017 election, or I think it may actually have been during the 2017 election in Germany, there was agreement between political parties not to use disinformation tactics, not to use black propaganda firms, for example. So there needs to be political will to not engage and leadership that's very public about this. So could there be a commitment from a Biden-Harris administration to avoid such tactics, to deliberately eschew the kinds of spin that very much creep towards misinformation and disinformation and propaganda practices? Could there also be an emphasis on another type of response to this crisis, which is the strengthening of investment in public interest journalism, independent, critical public interest journalism? Yes, we have issues with labeling what journalism is and what its function is online, as Emily's pointed out. But one of the important defense mechanisms is to ensure, particularly in light of the impacts of the pandemic on such news organizations, as Emily and I and her colleague Pete Brown have found with the Journalism and the Pandemic Project, there's economic gutting. There's also the gutting of capacity within news organizations to deal with these issues, the closing of doors. And Emily can speak to other research that's been done on this by her team, particularly in the US. But there has to be this other kind of investment beyond what we do with the platforms, which is a huge question that not enough people are focused on. But I'd offer those other thoughts as well.
Before I come to Paul and Phil, I'm just going to throw in another question to add on in case you feel like appending this to your response, Paul, Phil, anyone else. I have a question from a student asking, what is your opinion on Facebook's newly appointed Oversight Board? Is this a step in the right direction, or is it just contributing to the absolute power the company already wields? Is self-regulation or external government regulation better? Take it away.
Well, I'll address that just to add another topic to the mix. I think it's a modest step in the right direction, in that it's not going to, the Oversight Board is not going to resolve large numbers of individual appeals from content moderation decisions, but if it follows its design, it will help with transparency. It will set out to a greater degree the principles that the company will be following in making the many, many content moderation decisions that will never be reviewed by any outside board or internal mechanism, just because there's too many such decisions being made on a daily or hourly, minute by minute basis. So I think it's good, but it doesn't solve the continuing problem of how content moderation operates in the trenches. And on that subject, I think it's worth also considering. Phil was mentioning the very important point that the scale of content moderation operations is vast, and we should recognize that, all of which I agree with. We should also recognize the crucial decisions that the companies have made in connection with content moderation to outsource the vast majority of the human content moderation that takes place. That has consequences. It puts the activity at a distance from the core of the company. It saves money, which is a big part of its original motivation, but it also helps contribute, I think, to places that are at a great distance from Silicon Valley, not getting the kind of attention in content moderation that they deserve. It's a part of the explanation for why we end up with situations like Myanmar. I've written on the subject of whether content moderation should be brought in-house, which would be hugely expensive, but would make the companies much more immediately responsible for what's going on and make them grapple with how content moderation works on a routine basis.
Bill.
Yeah, those are great points. And in fact, Paul, I really, really like the work that you've done in analyzing the moderation issue, because it is, I agree, it is a very important issue. And I would say that both the Oversight Board and right now Facebook is also exploring another option, which is the idea of crowdsourcing fact-checking. These are directions that are being explored that might make things better, but my answer to the question is, who knows? It's early to say. So far, of course, these crowdsourcing systems are just being beta tested, so we don't know anything about them. And then in terms of the Oversight Board, really we don't really have yet any record to go on. But I would say that even in the cases where platforms have reasonable policies, there have been ample reports in the press, investigative journalism reports, that the application of those moderation policies have been somewhat uneven and driven by political considerations. You know, part of it, of course, the political environment in which we find, where we know that increasing willingness by the platforms to moderate dangerous content from the president and other members of the administration have been met with huge attacks and antitrust lawsuits. The questioning about Section 230 and about monopoly. And so all of these issues are happening in response to these decisions. So platforms, I think, are very well aware of the cost to be paid politically and in terms of user base of these decisions. And sometimes they react, or they drag their feet, or they react late, in large part because I think, not because they don't know how to do things, or they don't know what's going on, or they don't know how to recognize that Breitbart is a biased source or posting misinformation. They know all these things. But they have to constantly answer the question, which action do we take is going to cause the least harm? Because whatever we do is going to cause harm. It's going to be a public relation nightmare. We're going to be criticized either by this group or by this group. We're going to lose users. We're going to lose advertisers. So it's always an equation of what's going to be the cost. And I think that they have probably quite sophisticated, more sophisticated than we can imagine, tools to detect abuse of all sorts. Going back to what Emily was saying, they probably could detect misinformation to some degree, although, as I said, it's a hard problem, but they choose not to because they don't want to be seen as arbiters of the truth. So actually, they focus more on inauthentic behaviors like social bots and coordinated groups, especially if they're coming from the outside. The same exact behaviors that are coming domestically, they're much more reluctant to take down. So again, to me, it comes down not so much to technology or policy issues, but to political costs and equations. And that's why I think that there must be room for, going back to the question, right? Self-regulation versus, I think that self-regulation is very difficult because of these reasons. And so some political intervention to help set up these transparency policies and to help keep them to account in the enforcement of those policies, where, yeah, they make a system where if 3 strikes, you're out. But then is this really the 3rd strike? Or maybe we'll take it back. We've seen reports of these kind of uneven applications of those policy principles. So I think that there must be some room for regulation to help set guidelines and hold their feet to the fire.
So I have a question, actually. This is from me. So what you're describing, really, when it comes down to it, is I'm very struck by the kind of emphasis coming from my fellow non-Americans on the sort of need to avoid the responsibility, not avoid responsibility, but to change the focus a little away from the individual. And of course, that's the kind of essence of the problem that we're talking about here. So in my mind, this presents us also with a kind of a pedagogical challenge, which is, if we're trying to prepare students and ourselves for a future that looks less like the kind of hellish description we've just laid out. What are the implications for us? Like, what should we be teaching ourselves? What should we be teaching our students? Where should our resources be direct? What direction should our resources take for the classroom?
I can't answer much of that, but I did introduce a new course to Columbia Journalism School last year called Information Warfare Reporting, which is perhaps a bit dramatic, but the predication of it was that we teach reporters to go into physical hostile environments. That's one of the core skills that we teach: how to protect yourself, how to identify harm in physical terrain, and tactics that might be deployed against you. It struck me that far more of our students now go into hostile information environments. And, it's a known fact that what were once military tactics in cyberspace are being moved into the domestic and, civilian terrain. So I think one of the things that teaching that course, and I'll teach it again this year in a slightly refined form, is that you can bring in the work of people like Julie and Paul and Phil, and sort of synthesize those things into an understanding of, what are the problems. I mean, we had a great session last year on advertising technology. The number of journalists who just genuinely don't know the complexity of the ad tech ecosystem, and really that underpins a vast amount of our total information system. Like all of this at the end of the day is marketing one way or another. And I think that kind of teaching as we move into a world where everything is more mediated. I think media studies has always been looked down on. The idea of communication studies has always been looked down on. It's been looked as not real, as not part of politics, as not part of law. In a mediated world, those things are converging. So you can't think about politics without thinking about the mediated environment in which people encounter it. You can't think about civics without thinking about what the mediated space for that means. So actually, I'm really optimistic that we can move out of this box of, discussing newspapers or the soap opera on TV last night is not real academia. And actually, one of the things that I think is great about this this era, if you like, is that you do have centres like yours, centres like mine, research organisations like Julie's. There are several centres like this at NYU, which are coming into this new field, and they're producing tools, but they're also producing, new theories and interesting frameworks and ways of looking at this. And when I look in law schools and see really kind of committed, young, brilliant scholars wanting to work on antitrust, in new ways, I say I think that there is just a huge amount of opportunity here for pedagogy, but we have to start early, and we have to see that it's not something that can be separated off, and it needs to kind of inflect all sorts of other areas of teaching. That's that's an advertisement for all of our jobs, I think. But
well, thank you, Emily. I really appreciate that. Julie, Paul, and Phil, I'll throw that question out to you as well. And I just want to add in the phrase human rights, because I think, Julie, you picked up on that, and Paul, of course, it's inherent in the title of your centre, and this nexus between business and human rights, which is, I think, so often overlooked. Yeah. I think belongs in this conversation. Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely does. And I was about to say, and I'm, wearing a hat of former journalism educator. I'm not currently in a teaching role, but I spent 15 years teaching journalism in Australia, with time in places like South Africa as well, up until about 5 years ago, and watched the onset of these challenges, or at least the escalation of these challenges. And I think everything that Emily just said is important, but to underline the need for interdisciplinarity and collaboration, I think. So just as your centre is doing, Elaine and Phil, to bring together, computer scientists with potentially with linguists, but with journalism studies folks, political theory people, so sociologists, anthropologists. Like, we need to be ensuring that there is a genuinely, cross-disciplinary approach to educating our students because that is the way we will foster the development of solutions that they're going to carry the mantle for the most part. And I would say, in addition to Emily's points around a really important course that she's developed in the area of information combat or warfare. I can't remember the exact term you used, Emily. This is hostile environment territory. This is certainly a time where we need to reinforce those investigative skills and deepen the forensic, analytical capabilities that our students are developing, and the actual skills to do that work. But also, I would argue we need to strengthen their knowledge of investigative reporting when it comes to technology and business, and couple that with the information warfare, because I know Emily's concerned about this too, and others are as well. I certainly see a reluctance on the part of some news organizations, even some research centers, and certainly individuals who are working on covering technology, to critique the platforms. You know, there are journalists working exceptionally hard, doing remarkable work to hold their feet to the fire. It's a struggle to extract truth from some of these companies, frankly. And, you know, to enable our students to do that, and to allow them to actually foresee that they're going to need courage to do that. Because if you're taking that path, if your beat suddenly puts you in the same way that it might have 30 years ago put you in opposition to big tobacco when it was the biggest advertiser, then, you know, these are the sorts of things that I think ethically we need to bring into that model too.
Well, you were in the trenches of journalism for a long time. I think you can probably teach courage. So tell us, what's your view on this?
Well, I mean, I don't have much to say about journalism. I don't have anything to do with journalism education at the moment. I teach, while my center is at the business school at NYU, I actually teach at the law school. And in the vein of advertising for all of our jobs, I'll just underscore that my students at the law school show tremendous hunger for education having to do with the conduct, the behavior of social media companies, not because they're going to necessarily go into law that pertains to that, but because they are genuinely concerned as citizens, I think. And we have debates in the class that I teach about these things that in a very healthy way go on at great length with great vigor. And I think that more people ought to experiment with teaching about the choices and the dilemmas that confront the social media companies with a critical perspective, not taking their word for things, but being skeptical. And that approach has, for the last couple of years, has worked quite well for me.
Right, thank you. Phil, what do you think?
Elaine, I want to turn the question to you to say a little bit about what you're doing here at IU. But before that, I'll just take a minute to an observation. The work that our colleagues in the media school here have been doing recently is suggesting that young people can be just as vulnerable or more vulnerable to certain types of misinformation as older people, which is kind of against some earlier results from in the last few years that have mainly focused on older populations as being the most vulnerable. But invariably, as population ages, as the messages are crafted to target voters, we can expect that younger people will become just as vulnerable. And so I think that we have to keep that in mind. And when we think about literacy, I don't think that media literacy will be the full answer, as earlier was argued by I believe Emily. But it has to be something that we teach our children. And I think there is also some danger to the old style of literacy that just says, do your own research and be skeptic. Because we have to remember that this narrative of do your own research and be skeptic is actually right now exploited by conspiracy theorists. you know, I've asked my students, you know, what do? Something that where they were potentially vulnerable and not already knowledgeable about the area, they Google it. And if you Google, is the vaccine dangerous right now, you're going to run into a boatload of misinformation. So we have to be cognizant of new vulnerabilities, and that young people also experience, whether it is helping them realize that they are themselves part of echo chambers, and so what they see when they believe that something is very popular, it may not be true, or all the people who are pushing a particular idea may not be really independent of each other, or realize that they have their own limited attention, and therefore they use shortcuts, as we all do, to decide what to pay attention to, and that can be exploited, or you know, that our confirmation bias can be exploited, or you know, our emotional bias can be exploited. You know, being angry about something should be a warning bell not to share it. You know, so I think that there may be some new dimensions of vulnerabilities that we need to add to our toolkit of news literacy. And so I'm going to stop there, because I want you to talk a little bit about how we want to do some of those things at the college level.
Yes, thank you, Phil. Yeah, we do. We have about 2 minutes left, and so I'd love to respond to your question, but also just remind people that you will receive a survey if you have signed up for this panel in your email, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So please respond, audience, to our question to you as well. So I think that the theme that you've all picked up on so well of interdisciplinarity and collaboration, which is at the heart of everything I ever learned to do in a Reuters newsroom environment. I mean, what greater joy was there than to go out into the field with a person using a camera and a person using a video camera, and together to find out what the story was. That kind of collaborative environment is the one that I think, you know, we're really focused on in our work together, Phil, of trying to bring together different skill sets, different disciplines, different mindsets in an attempt to answer some of these complicated problems, because we will not be able to do these things by ourselves. Absolutely no way. So the master's program we're developing now in data journalism will actually bring together faculty from Phil's school and the media school. Will be designing courses together, which is incredibly exciting and of course really challenging. I mean, I remember when I was doing training as a journalist, we were basically told to do no math whatsoever, ever. Don't even add numbers up unless you absolutely have to. Whereas now we're so focused on trying to become more numerate, and that's something that I'm working on for myself, but also for our students together with Phil. So come and study data journalism with us. A quick advertisement. But I think I had one last question come in, which I'm just quickly going to throw out, and then we'll wrap up, which is, how can sponsors of platforms such as Facebook not be required to both identify and remove all false representations, together with a duty to explain to the reader why such representations are false, as long as they are permitted to make a profit? I feel like we may have answered this question already, but I'm not sure how we could not permit them to make a profit. But does anyone want to respond to that?
Sorry, I'll just say it very briefly. I think the question is a little bit on the naive side, because it assumes that there is a very black and white notion. And in reality, labeling something as plainly false or true is very difficult. A lot of the misinformation that we say revolves around nuggets of truths that are then spun around in ways that are misleading. So I think it's actually a very difficult thing to do.
Yes. So anyway, well, look, thank you everyone so much for a deep and broad conversation. I think we've covered a lot of territory. I'm glad I'm not in the Biden administration trying to figure out what the right thing to do next is. But I'm very glad to have been on this panel with you, Emily Bell, Paul Barrett, Julie Passetti, and my colleague Phil Menzer. And with thanks to the Hamilton Luger School for including us in this wonderful episode of America's Role in the World. And with thanks to our audience, I wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you,
Thanks for
everyone.
having us. Stay safe.